Thanks, it's such a pleasure to have been with you all this week at the Summer Institute, and I'm really looking forward to getting to share some of my recent work, which actually has a Scottish origin story as well. I'll be talking, one of the dancers whose work I'll be talking about today is in fact Scottish, so no whiskey was involved in the making of this presentation though. So I just want to give a couple of access notes before we begin. I am using a PowerPoint, and there is a hard copy of the PowerPoint as a handout. You know, the screen is fairly small, and the room is fairly large, so if you would prefer to have those materials in front of you, they're available. The slides are also available on Dropbox, along with a full copy of the script that I'm using for the talk, available in Word, so you're welcome to use any of those materials if they are helpful to you. I did use some images. I was hoping to show you a couple clips. We weren't able to get the tech worked out on that. Dropbox will hopefully have those clips available if you are interested. Just to let you know, I will describe the content images on all the content images on the slide as we go. All right. So, scholars working in disability studies have long recognized disability arts as a potent way to express the political and cultural power of disability experience. The arts are a way to confront stigma, challenge ableism, and claim disability as a provocative, vibrant source of beauty and vitality, creativity. In my talk today, I'd like to make the argument that disability arts are an important and often overlooked conversation partner for forging disability theologies and ethics. I am both a rabbi and a professor of Jewish studies, disability studies. As a scholar of Jewish texts and traditions, a lot of my work is devoted towards studying representations of disability in both the Hebrew Bible and in the Jewish sacred texts of Talmud and Midrash. Now, I love that work. I love working with ancient texts. I love the way it offers an opportunity to illuminate and critique power relations, power structures, and think about the cultural significance of disability, both in antiquity and in the contemporary world. But I want to make a confession. As a disabled woman, I rarely find my own life, my own spiritual life, reflected back in those representations of disability. Sometimes I'm frustrated with the limits of those sacred texts. Sometimes I'm frustrated with the limits of what they can imagine. So this project began with a different desire. It began with the desire to shiver something new into those texts, a desire to name the potent, persistent sacrality that I experience in disability circles, a kind of embodied ethics of mutuality and care, a brilliant creativity that has changed my life and the life of, I suspect, many other people in this room. It began with the desire to name something delicious and sacred about this body, these wheels. To speak of something that I know of spirit, not in spite of disability, but because of it. I found that most powerfully expressed in the work of disabled artists. Artists who are working to crack the chrysalis of shame that has so often been woven around disabled bodies and minds. Artists who resist the way disabled lives get disdained and discarded, who claim our lives, our realities, our ways of being as meaningful, powerful, and sacred. Disability artist Leah Lakshmi Pyapsna Samarasinghe describes disability performance as a prefigurative politics. It's a fancy word, she says, in order to describe the way we are building the world to come. She says, in a radically accessible performance space, in a disability performance space, we get a chance to smell and taste and feel things that we have always wanted but rarely witnessed, both in what we see on stage and how we interact and participate as an audience that is a community of witnesses. So for the past 2 years, I've been collaborating with my friend Claire Cunningham, a brilliant disabled dancer, choreographer, and performance maker who's based in Glasgow, Scotland. Today, I want to share with you some insights that have emerged out of that partnership. I'm not myself a dancer, but as we've worked together, I've been bringing Jewish story and Jewish sacred text into conversation with lived disability experience and disability arts. So today, I'll read Jewish traditions about Jacob and the angel, the Genesis story of Jacob and the angel, alongside a contemporary dance performance, The Way You Look at Me Tonight. So just a few words about this performance. The Way You Look at Me Tonight is an intimate duet between Claire Cunningham and Jess Curtis. Jess is an award-winning San Francisco-based performer. And The Way You Look is a multimedia production that combines contact improv and modern dance with the insights of a philosopher. It centers on practices of perception, the way bodies shape and constrain the way humans see, perceive, feel, know, and experience each other's presences. Now, I just want to be really clear. There's no actual connection, explicit connection that is, between The Way You Look and the Bible. There's no explicit engagement with religion in this piece. The Way You Look at Me Tonight is a straightforwardly secular, avowedly secular, I might even say, piece of performance. But as I've had a chance to partner with these artists, I've taken their performance as an invitation to do my own creative, religious, theological work, bringing their artistry into conversation with the Bible and with my own Jewish, feminist, queer, disability sensibilities. So, let's think together, think with me if you will, about a powerful and uncanny biblical story, the story of Jacob wrestling the angel. In Genesis 32, right before Jacob comes face to face with the estranged brother whose birthright he has stolen, Jacob encounters a stranger on the banks of the Yabok River. The man, the angel, Jacob, they wrestle all night long. Jacob's hip is wrenched, he gains a limp and wrests a blessing from the stranger. It is through this encounter that Jacob comes to be known as Israel, the one who strove with God and men and prevailed. Now, if you're looking for disability in this biblical story, I imagine you might find it, as I first did, as most people do, in Jacob's body. Jacob's hip is strained in the struggle, and when the sun rises over the river next morning, Jacob is, quote, limping on his hip. As someone who's spent a fair part of my early life limping on my hip, I always identify with this text. Now, I'll come back to that limping moment later on in this talk. But first, I want to go in a different direction. I want to locate disability in a different place. Rather than read Genesis 32 as the story of how the patriarch got his limp, I locate disability in the other body that dances and moves on the banks of the river, in the uncanny body of the angel. Now, let me be very plain. I don't mean that disabled people are angels in a sweet, sentimentalizing, saccharine way. In that respect, I take a resolutely anti-angelic view of disability. I'm identifying here with the angel very differently. In ancient Jewish thought, angels are uncanny beings. Their bodies are both wondrous and strange. In ancient biblical narrative, angels often go unrecognized. They spend a fair amount of their time passing as human until all of a sudden their difference is apprehended. So consider the angel who appears to Manoach's wife in Judges 13. When the woman tells her husband that an angel has appeared to her, Manoach begs, please, please, let that man of God come again. Well, he does. He does return. He comes again. But when the man of God comes back, Manoach doesn't recognize him as an angel. Until, of course, the man, quote unquote, ascends from a flaming altar into the sky. So at this point, Manoach is terrified. Manoach realizes he's encountered an angel, and he is absolutely convinced that he's going to die. It takes his wife's calming presence to reassure him that he can encounter a divine being and survive. Now, for me, this whole encounter is very resonant with disability experience. I think, first of all, of the way that people regularly fail to recognize disability. Sometimes that's because disability is imperceptible or invisible, largely passing out of people's awareness under the radar screen. Sometimes it's because people don't want to see or perceive difference. They don't want to acknowledge what difference might mean. Disabled people are often subject to a hyper-normalizing gaze, a gaze that denies our difference. And when our difference is centered, it's very commonly marked as a source of fear and threat. Disability activist Harriet McBride Johnson says, our culture often makes disabled people into death totems. We force ordinary folk, non-disabled folk, to confront the reality of human finitude. Like Manoach with the angel, I think sometimes people see me and realize they too are going to die. How difficult it is to move through the world this way, carrying the weight of other people's projections, anxieties, and fears. When I think of the angel in relation to disability, I'm struck also by the strangeness of the angel, the difference. In ancient Jewish thought, the angel is an uncanny body. Angels' forms are nearly human, but with a difference, with a twist. So consider the curious nature of the wing, which has a long history in the visual representation of the angel. So it's actually not clear the Hebrew Bible thinks that angels, or at least all angels, have wings. But when we look at the artistic tradition, the wing has a long history of being used as a signal for marking out angelic difference, distinguishing an angel's body from otherwise human-looking forms. Now, artists, though, have often failed, quite frankly, to grapple with the real mechanics of flight and the way that would restructure the human body. So what we get is sort of normate, ordinary human bodies with little wings tacked on. Edward Carpenter is a poet, philosopher, and social activist who was once memorably dubbed the gay godfather of the British left, has this brilliant essay on angels' wings. Carpenter talks about how as a kid, he got really fascinated looking at art. He got really fascinated by the question of how do the angels take off their clothes? So Carpenter spies Piero della Francesca's Baptism of Christ, with its three angels portrayed as three stout country girls looking on at the ceremony while Christ is baptized. And I gotta say, those angels do not pass Carpenter's test. On the left side of the slide, there's an angel standing with her back to us. She's wearing pink and blue, and this is what Carpenter says about her. Her wings come straight through her gown without the slightest little wrinkle. Now, Carpenter's really disappointed in this. He, as he writes about these images, and he writes also about thinking about the angel, he calls attention to the musculature, right? The muscles that flight requires. The way the traditional artistic choice to set the wings into the human shoulder blade would, quote, paralyze the wing in a way that no archangel even could surmount. Piero della Francesca's angel's wings are mere decoration. But a winged angel? An angel that could really fly? Well, that, my friends, that's an image I claim for disability. In classical Jewish narrative, angels are uncanny beings. They are exemplars of what disability studies theorist Rosemary Garland Thompson has called the wondrous strange. The wondrous strange. The winged angel is a figure that breaks with the normative expected human form. So imagine with me the angel as a disabled body. Imagine those wings as congenital differences, birth anomalies, what some people call birth defects. Imagine those wings as something that rubs a little strange and uncanny against a human eye. I share some kinship with an angel's strength. My wheeler's body has a muscle chest. These arms are built to lift my body's weight. Think with me about the physicalities of flight. In our biblical text, Jacob comes into intimate body contact with an angel, emerging both psychically and physically changed. When Jacob wraps his arms around the angel, when they wrestle by night until the break of dawn, Jacob has a visceral encounter with what I'm claiming is disabled flesh. What might this mean? So come with me now, if you would, into the world of disability dance. In the way you look at me tonight, Jess and Claire, the dancers Jess and Claire, engage in a score they call roll. So in one portion of their show, the two dancers begin lying on their backs, their heads pressed against each other, cheek to cheek. Jess is a lean, athletic, 6-foot-tall man with a shock of white hair. Claire is a small woman, muscled and slender. She uses forearm crutches. In this particular dance piece, in this score, she's working without her crutches. She and Jess use techniques from contact improvisation practice to slowly and deliberately roll over each other's bodies. They move gradually down the stage and back again, their flesh pressed into each other's flesh. Now, most audiences don't recognize how risky this part of the performance is for Claire. Claire can roll almost anywhere on Jess's body, except maybe for his knees. But there's only a thin stretch of her body where it is safe for Jess to roll. They know the two dancers have learned to do this piece. They've learned to recognize and know each other's physicalities intimately. Carefully and deliberately, they probe the contours of the safe zone, and they test and assess the malleable borders of risk every night, every time they do this piece. Thinking with this disability, I suggest, to wrestle means to know the contours of the body, to know what could cause pain and still generously, gently come near. The way you look suggests a potent insight into intimacy. That engagement with risk and negotiation of consent are the very constitutive grounds of intimacy, the very qualities that make intimacy possible. Want to do intimacy with someone? You have to know consent. You have to know risk. The very movements that my dancers do as they figure out how to negotiate the physicality of two very different bodies coming into close proximity with one another. For me, that was a visceral insight into what it means to do all kinds of human intimacy. Now, my thinking specifically about disability and intimacy has really been shaped by the incisive work of Mia Mingus. Mia Mingus argues that what she calls forced intimacy is a pervasive dimension of disabled people's lives in an ableist culture. Now, when we think about forced intimacy, I think we often think about things like sexual assault. And people with disabilities are indeed at higher risk of sexual violence. So Mingus wants to call attention to that. But she's also taking this concept in a different direction, into an even more pervasive dimension. She names other sorts of forced intimacies. For example, the expectation that we will share our personal stories or disclose details about our medical or psychiatric histories as a prerequisite for having our basic access needs met. The expectation on behalf of other people that our bodies somehow are public property, right? That they're available for viewing, for touching, for manipulating, for moving out of the way, just for staring at. So in a world where our bodies are so, and minds are so often subject to invasive gaze, invasive touch, or prurient curiosity, the power of consent is key. It's a key foundation of spiritual work. In the end of the dance piece, Rolling, that I was describing, that score, there's a voiceover where Jess says, describing the piece, "We give each other time to say no, thank you. Not with words, but with the lightest of touches." Rolling as a dance piece moves really slowly. It moves deliberately. The dancers need that slowness in order to be able to negotiate with each other. Again, not with words, but with the lightest of touches. Tactile language. Yes, this is okay. Yes, keep going. No, not there. Not now. Not yet. Now, alongside the problem of invasion, sort of consent refusals, violence, there's another different code, a different cultural code that surrounds disability, disabled people, and that's imposed difference. Imposed distance. Distance is a barrier to intimacy. And here I'm not just talking about erotic intimacy or sexual intimacy, but all kinds of social interactions, friendships, connections. So often people hold disabled folks at bay, right? Keeping distance. Intimacy means drawing near enough to take the risk, while at the same time listening for that breath that says, not now, not here, not yet. So consent is a key element of Jess and Claire's work together. The entire show is built around, right, thinking about and practicing consent. The show is staged unconventionally. Much of the audience is on chairs and cushions, and these are spaced quixotically throughout the performance space. Audience members who prefer no contact with the performers are invited to sit on the edges of the space. In one score, Claire begins by walking on Jess's prone body. So she is traversing his feet, his sides, his chest. Her crutches are on the floor, and her feet are on his flesh. As the piece unfolds, Claire brings the same style of movement into and among the audience. So she moves among the audience, her bare feet on our shoes, on the footplates of our wheelchairs. This piece, too, unfolds quite slowly and deliberately. Claire says it's about taking time, reading permission. Some people will put their feet out there, inviting contact. Other people will tuck their feet away, their gesture saying no without words. So one of the things that really moved me when I've been a part of this piece is that Claire deliberately doesn't shy away from other disabled people's bodies. She doesn't shy away from wheelchair users. She's assessing surface, calculating trajectory, balance, and weight. She's gauging other people's safety and her own, right? She's reading my wheelchair to try and figure out where she can safely step, where she can safely place her weight. She says, describing this piece, "There's a constant edge of readiness. I have to be ready to pull back if ever I cross a boundary of someone's safety." So one of the things that's really beautiful about this piece is that through most of the performance, people are looking at their feet. I think what's happening is that they're seeing their own bodies anew in light of Claire's presence. When Claire comes to another person, she will often linger, waiting to see if the person will look up and meet her eyes. Almost always, they look at her face and they smile. Now the Jacob narrative, the story of Jacob and the angel, I want to suggest, is navigating, likewise, this thin space between intimacy and risk. The medieval Torah commentator Rashi, writing about this biblical narrative, picks up on an unusual verb for wrestling, ye'avek. He says, what does this mean, ye'avek, to wrestle? Maybe it's reminiscent of the dust, avak, that the pair raise with their feet. But Rashi doesn't actually like that interpretation best. He gives a different interpretation based on the Aramaic word for they became attached. This is what he says. Such is the habit of two people who make a strong effort to throw each other down. One embraces the other and attaches himself to his arms. So for Rashi, that wrestling scene between Jacob and the angel is simultaneously a moment of risk, maybe even violence, and embrace. Now, most readers, I think, tend to find violence in this tale, in that moment when the angel, quote, wrenches Jacob's hip. But beyond the familiar translation, the Hebrew is actually more enigmatic. The verb there is naga, to touch, to reach, or to strike. Now, you can certainly read naga. You can naga someone as a pretty hard-edged, violent action. Right? I'm not recommending it. But you can also naga in a more gentle way. You can touch them. So what if we read this moment, this biblical moment, as less of a strike and more of a touch? Might we take Jacob's limp as a generative site of pain and possibility, a reminder that to touch is always to change? So this charged moment, when the angel touches Jacob, reminds me of what it means to come into encounter with disability. There's often, I think, a kind of dislocation, physical or psychic, that flows out of a sudden proximity to disability. Disability reshapes the way we think and feel and experience. The angel's touch brings Jacob into disability experience. This is the moment that Jacob acquires his limb. Now, traditional Jewish interpreters, when they read this story of Jacob and the angel, are very quick to stress that Jacob's disability is not permanent. Interpreting Genesis 33:18, which states that Jacob arrived safe, the Hebrew word here is whole or shalem, in Shechem. The Midrash Genesis Rabbah claims that Jacob's impairment was cured. So I'm going to go to Rashi again, glossing this verse. Rashi comments that Jacob arrives whole, shalem, whole in body, in finances, and with regard to Torah. So Rashi says, he's whole in body, cured of his limp. He's reconciled with his brother and he regains his cattle. His mind is honed. His fortune, in the full sense of the term, has been restored. This reading has always irked me. Makes me angry for the way that it imagines Jacob's limping body as an impediment to his heroism. For the way that it treats disability, it refuses to consider disability as a significant part of Jacob's mature adulthood. So I read Jacob's arrival in Shechem totally differently. I prefer to imagine that he attains wholeness, that he becomes shalem, not by erasing his impairment, but by incorporating it into his sense of self. Jacob arrives whole in Shechem, not because he strides in unaffected by his encounters on the road, but because he has integrated disability into his identity, because he has allowed himself to be changed by the angel's touch. There's a powerful experience of disability encounter at the heart of The Way You Look, and that's in the way that Jess draws near to disability. At the outset of the performance, I think most audiences read Jess as an unequivocally non-disabled body. He's athletic, masculine, hyper-capable, tall, big, strong. Over the course of the piece, though, that reading begins to fray. Claire, who's a crutches user, Claire schools Jess in the art of how to properly use crutches. Now, this is a piece that explicitly critiques the way that some non-disabled performers appropriate disability for the sake of artistic exploration without a genuine engagement with disability experience. But at the same time, I'm interested in this moment because the performance also refuses to draw a tight boundary around the category of disability. Over the course of the performance, Jess probes his own changing physicality. And audience learns that arthritis has been changing the contours of his own hip. So Jess brushes the edge of possibility. Right? Though he identifies as a non-disabled dancer, right? He too comes to acknowledge that impairment, and to a certain extent disability experience, is also beginning to touch and shape his own embodied life. So there's a score in this piece where Jess is exploring what he can do as a dancer who's living now with arthritis, exploring what can be done in his body without pain. Claire gives him an assignment. She tells him to dance, but tells him he's not allowed to do what hurts. So if he does something that hurts, he's got to find a different way. At one point in this piece, Jess roars. It's a moment when, as a dancer, he gives animal voice to frustration, to limit, and to loss. And then, out of that moment of pain and frustration, he spins out into this brilliant solo dance. This, I believe, is the movement of a dancer who knows what it means to limp, who knows how the changed and changing body can become a locus of artistic possibility. This is no easy embrace. As an audience, we get to hear Jess grapple with anger, with grief. We feel the raw edges of kinesthetic terrain, the terrain his body can no longer traverse. I find it particularly powerful because as an audience, we're sitting right in his midst, not far away, not even as distant as you all are from me, but right around him as he's moving, as he's crying out, as he's dancing. In these moments, I think, the way you look evokes a different kind of wrestling. The wrestling that happens after the angel has come and gone, when the limp remains. So I wonder, does the aftermath go hard with Jacob in the days that follow? The biblical story, the biblical narrator, gives us no hint of this landscape. Such emotions live entirely on the margins of the tale. The Midrash refuses the question. It gives us a patriarch who is unmarked by any meaningful engagement with disability. I think that's an evasion. Bodies know this, or they learn how to grapple with limit, how to tangle with finitude. Through this piece, through this performance, this disability dance, I witness the body knowledge that emerges out of Jess's choice to turn toward disability, to probe what it offers, to explore what is lost, what is new, and what remains. Is this what coming into genuine encounter with disability offers artists, offers us all? Might this be a kind of generative possibility that Jacob gains? When I think of Jacob's limp, I recall Rosemary Garland Thompson's insight that disability is a natural unfolding of human being, the etchings of flesh as it encounters word. I read the limp as a remnant of encounter, a register of the angel's presence, a mark that the body retains. And yet, this ordinariness is not, it's the only part of the story. This quotidian ordinariness of disability, this idea of disability as just the ordinary etchings of life on flesh, it can't fully encompass the experience of disability as difference, the experience of disability as a difference that can be luminous, provocative, powerful, extraordinary. When I watch Claire's movement, when I watch her work with crutches as partners and presences, I see how her crutches have become extensions of her body, material expressions of support that she has turned through expertise, kinship, and artistic sensibility into sturdy, supple limbs, into, dare I say it, wings. Claire's crutches make possible a certain kind of movement. Lift, height, suspension. These are all qualities I associate with flight. But now, friends, we must be very careful here. Sometimes we fantasize flight as an escape from the body, a flight from disability. Claire's work is precisely the opposite. The exquisite beauty of her movement on crutches becomes possible because of disability, because of the expertise her disability engenders. In a score that Jess and Claire call Perch and Pounce, Claire moves at great speed over and around Jess's body, using her crutches to lift and jump and pivot. There's a scene in the performance that begins with Jess low to the ground. His body is mostly on the floor, his knees are bent, and Claire moves fluidly among the audience, on stage, her steps fast and light, the music up-tempo and staccato, fast, fast, fast. Claire approaches Jess, plants her crutches to either sides of his legs, and then levers her body up, lands her feet on his knees. She spins, she pivots, she hovers in the air, and then, light as a feather, touches her toes against his body, pushes off to spin again, crutch, 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 twist, lift, pivot, land. This score, this fast-paced movement is entirely improvised. It is not blocked out in advance. It is not planned. It can't be planned. The specific path of motion that Claire takes is made anew each night by the configuration of the audience, by the variability and the mobility of the human environment. So what we're seeing in this moment is disability expertise in action. It's a visible manifestation of a specific skill set that Claire has refined as a user of crutches. Perch and pounce, Claire says, is an articulation of how I see the world. Claire can read the physics of an object she lands on. She knows how to put her weight directly upon it, straight through it, without knocking it over. It's a very specific skill she has, to be able to look at environment, to look, in this case, at Jess's body, and read it very fast. So here's how she describes it. I'm looking at Jess as landscape. He's terrain. It's the same way when I read the ground. It's like the parkour of that, the ability to go up and over at incredible speed. This score takes advantage of a particular physical quality of Claire's movement with crutches, embellishing the way ordinary crutch walk gives a body lift, support, and suspension. Crutches allow Claire to hover in the air. So there's a moment in that scene where Claire holds herself horizontal on crutches. It's a breath of perfect suspension. And then she sweeps her leg into a slow, deliberate curve and brings her feet lightly back to the ground. When she brings her feet against surface, her touch is so gentle. I know this, in fact, because Claire has done perch and pounce and landed her toes on my knees. She weighs next to nothing. Not because she's a small woman, she is a small woman, but because her weight is all in the crutch. So the touch of her toes is like the breath of what I might do with a finger. She lands with exquisite precision, with gentleness. I've seen her touch down among a woman's crossed arms. This is the moment in the way you look that I liken to flight. It's the visible inbreaking of disability difference, a moment when we get to experience its breathtaking strangeness, its otherness, its beauty, untethered by the confines or expectations of normalcy. To fully encompass the significance of disability, its cultural power, what it can mean, what it can be, we gotta leave space for this kind of radical otherness, this brilliant difference. The way that disability reveals, in blind theologian John Hull's words, the presence of alternate worlds. So I want to close by reflecting on a quality of the way you look that I find particularly significant. Its profoundly improvisational character. The fact that Jess and Claire have got to work out a lot of this piece as they go along. That quality of improvisation demands a tremendous amount of trust. Not just in the other person's intention, but also in their reflex, in their skill. Because the performance is so fluid, because the movements can't be fully scripted in advance, the performance itself immerses Claire and Jess in a practice of paying attention to each other. This work requires an acute sensitivity to the other's body, a demanding practice of perception. Near the close of the show, Jess and Claire perform a piece they call Tall Crutches. Tall Crutches is a score in which Claire works on crutches that have been raised up to Jess's height, crutches that vault her off the ground and into the air. She and Jess dance for the first time, cheek to cheek. Right? So her feet are dangling in the air, and her body is boosted up to Jess's height. And they're sharing in this moment what the philosopher Alva Noah calls, quote, a precarious slow dance. It's quite precarious. Watching Claire lever herself into the air, finding her balance in Jess's arms, I see balance visible as a tenuous physical act. Alva recognizes in this exchange a profound insight into human intimacy. He says, maybe every slow dance is precarious in this way. In the way you look, Jess and Claire recognize the physical practice of attending to another person's body as the very practice of love. What love means. Love, they suggest, isn't just an expression of feeling. It's not just an overflow of the heart. It comes alive through physical geography. This, Claire says, is access. This practice of attention. Access isn't simply a solution, a technical solution to inhospitable architecture. It's a quality of relationship. Access is a kind of intimacy. Access is an investment of time and care and trust. Access is a practice of attention, a recognition, as Claire says, that the perception of you is, in this very moment, love. Thank you. So I think we're going to have a moment now for some questions. You're welcome to ask me questions, but I also just want to say you're also just welcome to share reactions, thoughts, feelings, how something landed with you. So that's also very meaningful for me, so please feel free to do that if you are so inclined. Okay. So can we get a mic on to the floor?
Thank you so much for that. I celebrate the ways in which, as a theologian myself, I'm invited again and again to wrestle with text to find meaning-making for my own spirituality and those of others that I get to encounter. And so I'm so deeply moved by this wrestling with Jacob and the angel. How many times have I listened to a sermon on this text, right? And so I want to ask you if off the top of your head you could point me to other texts that might invite that same sort of possibility for me as a theologian to kind of play around with and look more deeply at, where one is changed by the encounter of the other.
What a great question. Thank you so much. So I'm paging back through my slides here to come back to another image at the very beginning that I love. Okay. This is an image by Olivia Wise that was commissioned in response to a piece I wrote called God on Wheels. And it's the magazine Tikkun published that piece and commissioned this piece of art. The image shows a woman in a wheelchair, mainly in reds and kind of fire tones, and the wheelchair is a beautiful, rich blue. You get a nice shot of the top of a wheel. The woman has her arms up, and the whole image is done through brush strokes that evoke flight, movement, spin, rotation. So this is an image that, as I said, was commissioned in response to a piece I wrote about first chapter of Ezekiel and the divine chariot, which, so as a wheelchair user, I had a really wonderful moment with the book of Ezekiel, which is read in Jewish communities on Shavuot, the holiday of Shavuot. It's usually taken in traditional contexts as a way of thinking about mystical ascent, blah, blah, blah. I never really got into that. I'm fascinated by it as a scholar or whatever. It just didn't do anything for my own spiritual life. Until one morning I was listening to that image of the prophet Ezekiel seeing God in a chariot, and he really dwells on the wheels within wheels. And I was like, God has wheels. Yes. And then I thought, there are moments in my life as a wheelchair user where I feel a kind of pleasure in movement. For me, it's often like going down a gentle grade, not too steep, but steep enough that you can really, the wheels can really work for me. Right? And the wind's behind me a little bit, and I feel, right? So for me anyway, one of the dimensions of my physicality is I feel a lot through my wheelchair. So I feel a vibration of the earth, of the pavement, of every little tree root I've ever run over, come rumbling up through my little caster wheels, up through the frame of my wheelchair, into my sit bones, right? Up into my shoulders if it's a bad tree root. Which means there's a very organic relationship between land, wheel, body, breath, right? Every stroke for me, right? Every time I stroke back, right? It's like pull my muscles out. It's like opening up the heart. I feel the breath run back through me. For me, it's a very organic system. So that image of God on wheels gave me a way of thinking, like, maybe God knows that. Maybe God has that kind of relationship with the world. Right? I wasn't looking to like authorize my own life. I don't actually feel like I need the Bible to do that. But I am always interested in looking for moments of kinship, in moments where I felt like, oh yeah, maybe you do get it. Maybe you do know something of this wild, beautiful, unexpected, pretty non-normative, delicious life. So your mileage may vary, but that for me was another moment where I found a moment of disability Torah, right? Where it flipped back.
Thank you again for your talk. Every time I hear you speak, I have so many questions afterwards. So,
That means I'm doing my job.
Exactly. Yeah. I used to teach a course called religion, medicine, suffering, and religious belief. And I would use this Jacob text as one of the texts for the course. I had students read two different pieces in conjunction with the text. The one was by a Jewish author, Leora Batnitsky, who wrote it's called On the Suffering of God's Chosen. And the other is Salva Fici Dolores, which is a papal letter by John Paul II. Each of them in their texts say that Jacob is chosen because he has integrated his suffering into his identity. And so I'm super interested in your slide. I think it's the second one on Rashi on Genesis 33:18, where you say, but because he has integrated disability into his identity. And I'm wondering if you could reflect on the change that that word makes.
Yeah, absolutely. See if I can get back to that slide. So is that the right slide?
The next one.
Thank you. All right. So because I really like reading the story through the prism of disability, and because I get a little allergic to the equation that happens between disability and suffering, I tend not to go that route. Okay? I think that I don't want to minimize the fact. I mean, the reality is that suffering is a part of people's disability experience, and suffering is a part of people's human experience. So I don't want to suggest that there's no relationship between these two things, and that disability might not at times be an experience of suffering. But I am concerned about the way in which it has come to seem so easy for so many folks to assume that disability and suffering are cognates, that they're basically like, when we're talking about disability, we're talking about suffering, and vice versa. So this is one of the reasons that I really wanted to think differently about how we might understand this encounter, and how we might want to think about what it means for Jacob to be, I was just going to say touched by the angel, which didn't quite come out the way that I wanted it to come out. So let me just say that angel's touch, right, might have a different valence, a different kind of quality than we're used to reading it. So first of all, I don't assume that to limp means to suffer, right? I don't think that limping necessarily goes along with pain. I think limping can be actually a really interesting, creative, quirky, and useful way to get through the world. I say this as someone who spent the first part of my life limping a lot. I did it reasonably well. I guess I just don't see a lot of suffering here in Jacob. I think that one of the things that's so striking, so powerful about these stories is that they're quite enigmatic. They leave so much unsaid. The affect, the emotional experience that Jacob has is largely left for us as readers, as commentators, as thinkers, to determine. Which means that you might very well feel this moment as a moment of suffering, but you might also not. And I'd like to make a plug for trying out what happens if this is not a story about suffering. Right? If this is actually a story about a different kind of intimacy, a different kind of connectedness between Jacob and the angel, one that is marked by some tension and some struggle, okay? But one that ultimately resolves with a blessing, with a naming, with things that I read through the lens of both Hebrew Bible and later Jewish tradition as marks of real connection between parties, right? To give a blessing, to give a new name, these are acts of generosity. These don't suggest to me the angel as violator. So that's a little bit about where some of the textual moments that for me have been important in rethinking that variance.
Hi, this is Kirsty speaking. I'm kind of two tables from the right, as you're at the back of the room. I have a question about intimacy and consent, moving from someone with a disability towards someone without. It got me thinking about the permission to be in someone's space, and how important it is to ask for that. You really underscored that. But I'm wondering about does the person without a disability have the right to be uncomfortable in the presence of the person who does have a disability, and to therefore withdraw themselves or to ask someone to withdraw from their space? I'm asking because if they can, there are so many spaces that people with disabilities should not be present because no one is comfortable with them there. So how do we kind of handle the delicate balance between advocating for presence in communities at the same time as respecting people's own bodies and presence within them?
That's a really wonderful question. So I think, first of all, for me, it is when we're thinking about. I want to first take this on an interpersonal level. Right? I think it's helpful to think about this question in a couple of different frames. So let's think first on the interpersonal level. That is when two people are in relationship with one another, right? Or in encountering one another. Right? That's a situation where I think it's critical that consent flows both ways. Okay? And in fact, I think consent is, so we sometimes think about consent as a real, straightforward thing. I give you consent, I withhold consent. I think this is not the most helpful paradigm to think about what really happens when we are, I prefer the paradigm of negotiating consent. So obviously there's clear consent violations, right? I want to leave those aside for a moment and instead think about what happens when consent is getting worked out. Right? That is, people are figuring out what each other's boundaries are, and boundaries are themselves a shifting and malleable thing. Right? Like I mentioned in this performance, they get redrawn anew every night, both because people's comfort levels change, but also I think about my dancers, right? Their physicalities are shifting. Right? So what worked yesterday might not work today. Right? So when we think about consent as something that gets negotiated, that I think helps give me a framework for thinking about that negotiating being something that both parties or all parties need to work with. Right? So that I do think that this is not just a matter for non-disabled people, right? But when you framed it in that way, but I'll say, so I'll stick with that for a second, but then also say I think it also is not just about that. When non-disabled, I think it's worth it for non-disabled people to be aware of discomfort. Right? And think about that also as a thing that might get, right? We can choose, and here's where I'll say, as a disabled person, I sometimes also experience discomfort in the presence of other people's disabilities, right? Just because I'm a wheelchair user doesn't mean I sort of got it all figured out with all forms of disability experience ever. Alas, the wheels did not come with that upgrade. So think that I have found for myself that thinking about discomfort is something that can be, that is a reaction, right? That can be worked with and often shifted, right? But that sometimes I do have boundaries. So we talk about in disability community also sometimes competing access needs, right? One person's access need might be my access disaster, right? So these things get negotiated. So I do think there are moments when it is appropriate for a non-disabled person, for another disabled person to also assert their own consent boundaries, to say, no, I need my space, or no, I'm not comfortable with that. No, I can't do that for you, with you, you know. That's on the interpersonal level. Now let's talk about the social, structural, societal level, because that's where, right, I think the idea of discomfort often plays out in a different way. And that's where I'd say I feel a real urgency that socially and culturally we collectively need to get better about checking that idea that disability makes people uncomfortable, and so it should be hidden away, pushed to the side. Access is an inconvenience. It looks ugly. It doesn't have to look ugly, actually, but even if it does, so I think that on the social level, I feel much more willingness to want to push back, because I have often heard and felt and experienced that idea of other people's real or perceived discomfort with disability being a kind of code for saying, we can't have you here.
Rabbi, thank you for your presentation. I have a question.
Can you identify where you are in the room?
Right here.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
The question I had is this. The story of Jacob and the angel does include, as you mentioned, a blessing and a change of name. How can we look at that without falling into the dangers of seeing it as Shane talked about earlier, the inspiration born?
Yeah.
You know, what is it to be blessed and yet not made of someone to be put on a pedestal or admired from afar, in a sense? Blessing and connection.
Yeah. So, I'd like to make a request of all of you in this room, which is if you are in a different setting and have the opportunity to retell some of this material, some of what I said about Ezekiel, don't give it an inspirational spin. Give it grit. Give it. Don't pretty it up. Make it hard-edged enough. Don't draw a pretty story out of it that leaves like that story I told you about Ezekiel and the divine chariot. There are years, probably 30 years of struggle against ableism behind that story. I didn't just happen one day to think, oh, God's a wheelchair user. Great. The work that it takes to make that shift, the work that it takes to see this life as sacred is built for me out of political struggle, community building, and resistance to ableism. So, I challenge you and I ask you, if you teach some version of this kind of disability Torah, I need it to be political. I need it to name violence against disabled people. I need it to retain some edge of struggle. Not struggle against disability or struggle against body or struggle against like all that crap. Struggle against social oppression. So, that's how I say, that's how we avoid the inspiration trap, right? But it is a tremendous act of trust for me to tell you these stories. Because when I tell you these stories, they go out into the world and I don't have control over how you tell them. So that's why I say, I ask you, I challenge you, leave the grit in it. Challenge yourself to tell this story in a way that my adapt comrades and secular disability activist folk would be like, all right, I can't believe that happened in a church, but at least they named it, right? Do that for me. Do that for me, and then you will be telling a kind of Torah that keeps my full self in.